On Friday, November 10, 1944, as the first light crept over the frost-covered ground of northeastern France, black tank crews climbed into Sherman tanks already scarred by earlier fighting. Engines coughed in the cold air, radios crackled with clipped commands, and the smell of fuel mixed with damp earth. For the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, this morning marked neither a beginning nor an end, but another day in what would become 183 consecutive days of combat in World War II. They had already been fighting for weeks without relief, and they would continue to fight long after many other units were rotated out, sustaining General George S. Patton's Third Army at a moment when collapse was a real possibility. The 761st Tank Battalion had been activated more than 2 years earlier, in April 1942, under the constraints of a segregated United States Army. Black soldiers were considered suitable for labor and logistics, but rarely trusted with front-line armored combat. Tanks were complex machines that demanded technical skill, coordination, and calm under pressure, qualities Army leadership often denied black troops possessed. Yet the formation of the 761st reflected wartime necessity as much as ideology, an experiment shaped by manpower demands rather than equality. From its inception, the battalion trained under suspicion, preparing for a battlefield many believed they would never see in World War II. Training camps in Louisiana and later in Texas exposed the men to grueling routines and constant evaluation. Equipment was often outdated, ammunition limited, and opportunities for advanced training constrained. Mistakes that would be considered routine in white units were cited as evidence of racial deficiency. Despite this, the battalion developed strong internal discipline. Tank crews learned to trust one another absolutely, understanding that survival depended on coordination inside cramped steel hulls where one failure could doom all. This cohesion would later prove decisive during their extended service in World War II. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had broken open the Western Front. American forces surged across France, but German resistance stiffened as units retreated toward prepared defensive lines. Casualties among armored formations were severe. Tanks were knocked out by mines, anti-tank guns, and close-range infantry weapons. Patton's Third Army, activated in August, moved faster than supply lines could easily support. By autumn, the need for fresh, reliable armored units became urgent. Patton was a commander driven by momentum. He believed hesitation gave the enemy time to recover, and he demanded continuous pressure. When the 761st Tank Battalion was finally assigned to his army, it was less an act of social progress than operational necessity. Patton needed tanks and crews who could fight immediately. His message to the battalion was blunt and unsentimental. He expected them to perform, and he would judge them by results alone. In the context of World War II, this expectation placed the 761st in a uniquely exposed position, where failure would reinforce prejudice and success would challenge it. The battalion entered combat in October 1944 during the Lorraine campaign, attached to the 26th Infantry Division. The terrain was unforgiving. Forests, muddy roads, and fortified villages neutralized many advantages of armored warfare. German forces, though retreating, fought stubbornly from prepared positions. Tank crews advanced slowly, often under fire from unseen anti-tank guns. Losses began almost immediately. Tanks burned, crews bailed out under machine gun fire, and replacements were scarce. Still, tanks rolled forward. Each successful mission reinforced Patton's confidence that this unit could be relied upon when others were exhausted. As November deepened, the battalion faced increasingly coordinated German resistance. Enemy units employed combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, artillery, and armor to blunt Allied advances. The 761st adapted quickly. Tank commanders learned to work closely with infantry, advancing only when foot soldiers could clear threats hidden in forests and buildings. This cooperation, essential to survival in World War II, was forged through repeated exposure to danger rather than formal doctrine. By December 1944, winter had arrived with brutal force. Temperatures dropped below freezing, fuel gelled, and frostbite became a constant threat. It was under these conditions that German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Patton's Third Army was ordered to pivot north to contain the attack. The 761st, already worn down by weeks of combat, was redeployed without pause. The battalion fought in snow-covered forests, where visibility was limited and ambushes common. German infantry armed with anti-tank weapons stalked the tanks, while artillery fire shattered trees into deadly splinters. Crews fought numb with cold, often unable to remove gloves without risking frostbite. Yet they continued to operate, supporting infantry defenses and counterattacks that slowed the German advance. Their actions during this phase helped stabilize a front that threatened to unravel Allied plans in World War II. The psychological strain of continuous combat was immense. There was no clear sense of duration, no expectation of relief. Soldiers learned to focus on immediate tasks, suppressing thoughts of exhaustion or fear. Leadership within the battalion emphasized routine and discipline as anchors in chaos. Orders were followed, maintenance performed, and missions executed despite mountain casualties. This capacity to function under extreme stress became one of the battalion's defining characteristics. When German resistance failed and Allied forces resumed their advance in early 1945, the 761st remained at the front. They crossed rivers under fire, supported assaults on fortified towns, and pursued retreating enemy units into Germany. Each engagement added to the tally of days in combat. By this stage, the battalion had become an integral part of Third Army operations, trusted to perform under the most demanding conditions. German resistance varied from organized defensive lines to desperate delaying actions. Tank crews learned to recognize patterns, anticipating ambushes and adjusting formations accordingly. Experience replaced initial uncertainty. New replacements, often arriving directly from training depots, were absorbed into crews hardened by months of fighting. In World War II, such continuity was rare, making the 761st's sustained effectiveness even more remarkable. Interactions with liberated civilians revealed another layer of the battalion's experience. In France, Belgium, and Germany, civilians responded with a mix of gratitude, curiosity, and surprise. For many Europeans, seeing Black American tankers contradicted assumptions shaped by both Nazi propaganda and American segregation. These encounters highlighted the global contradictions of World War II, where ideals of freedom clashed with realities of discrimination.
Despite their performance, formal recognition remained limited during the war. Awards were slow to come, and official histories paid little attention to the battalion's extended service. Within Third Army, however, the 761st was increasingly viewed as a unit that could be committed to difficult missions without hesitation. Patton's reliance on them was a tacit acknowledgement of their value, even if broader institutional attitudes lagged behind battlefield reality. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion had logged 183 consecutive days of combat, one of the longest continuous frontline records of any American armored unit in World War II. Casualties were heavy, vehicles destroyed and replaced, and crews physically and emotionally drained. Yet the battalion remained operational until the end, a testament to endurance forged under conditions of constant danger. The immediate post-war period brought demobilization, but not equality. Veterans returned to a segregated society that often ignored their service. The contrast between their responsibility in combat and their treatment at home underscored unresolved tensions within American democracy. Still, their wartime record could not be erased. Official reports documented their performance, creating a factual foundation for later reassessment. In subsequent decades, historians revisited the experience of the 761st to better understand how World War II reshaped the U.S. Army. Their extended combat service challenged assumptions about race, endurance, and effectiveness. Military analysts noted that continuous deployment, rather than degrading performance, had produced a highly cohesive and adaptable unit. The story of black tankers fighting for 183 straight days reveals more than tactical achievement. It exposes how necessity can force institutions to confront their own contradictions. Patton's Third Army depended on the very soldiers the Army had long doubted, and in doing so, relied on their discipline, skill, and resilience to sustain momentum at a critical juncture of World War II. As records were declassified and veterans shared their experiences, the battalion's role gained broader recognition. Their story became part of a larger narrative connecting military service to civil rights, illustrating how battlefield performance undermined the logic of segregation. While change came slowly, the evidence left by their service endured. The legacy of the 761st Tank Battalion continues to inform how World War II is studied and taught. Their 183 days of continuous combat stand as a measure of endurance and professionalism under conditions few units faced. Without dramatic declarations or official fanfare, they fought day after day, sustaining an army that could not afford to fail, and in doing so, reshaped the understanding of who could carry the heaviest burden of war.
In the years after the war, military analysts began to study the operational tempo of Patton's Third Army in detail, trying to understand how certain formations maintained effectiveness while others required frequent relief. Within these studies, the record of the 761st Tank Battalion stood out. Their 183 days of continuous combat were not an accident of poor planning, but the result of repeated decisions to keep a proven unit in the line. In World War II, such decisions were driven by necessity, yet they also revealed which units commanders trusted when conditions deteriorated. The battalion's endurance reshaped internal perceptions within armored forces. Officers who had initially viewed segregated tank units as experimental began to cite the 761st as evidence that cohesion and training mattered more than preconceived notions. Informal assessments circulated among staff officers noted that the battalion's maintenance rates, response times, and coordination with infantry were consistently high despite fatigue. These observations, while rarely publicized, entered the professional memory of the Army shaped by World War II. For the tankers themselves, the psychological impact of sustained combat lingered long after the guns fell silent. Many veterans later described how the absence of rotation created a distorted sense of time, where weeks passed without clear markers. Combat became routine, danger normalized, and survival depended on suppressing emotional response. This mental adaptation, forged during World War II, influenced how veterans approached civilian life, often creating a disconnect between wartime experience and post-war expectations. The 761st's experience also contributed to evolving doctrines on armored infantry cooperation. After-action reports emphasized how closely tanks had to work with foot soldiers in restrictive terrain. Forests, villages, and narrow roads limited maneuver and exposed tanks to close-range threats. The battalion's success under these conditions demonstrated that armored units could remain effective outside open-field engagements, a lesson increasingly incorporated into post-World War II training.
As the Cold War began, the United States Army reassessed its force structure in light of potential large-scale conflict. Studies of World War II highlighted the importance of manpower utilization and unit cohesion. The documented performance of the 761st undermined arguments that segregation enhanced efficiency. While policy change was gradual, the battalion's record became part of the factual basis supporting integration, showing that prolonged exposure to combat did not degrade performance when leadership and training were sound. The delayed recognition of the battalion reflected broader patterns in how World War II was remembered. Public narratives often favored dramatic offensives and well-known commanders, leaving little space for units whose significance lay in sustained reliability rather than singular moments. Over time, however, historians began to emphasize endurance as a critical factor in victory. Within this framework, the 761st's continuous service emerged as a defining contribution.
Educational institutions incorporated these findings into curricula that examined World War II beyond its headline battles. Cadets and officers studied how Patton managed tempo, logistics, and morale, and how units like the 761st absorbed operational strain. These case studies illustrated that success depended not only on aggressive leadership, but on soldiers capable of executing orders day after day without relief. The battalion's story also influenced how veterans organizations framed the legacy of Black service members. By emphasizing sustained frontline combat, advocates challenged lingering stereotypes that minimized Black participation in decisive fighting. World War II thus became a reference point in broader discussions about citizenship, sacrifice, and recognition, with the 761st serving as concrete evidence rather than abstract argument. As more personal accounts surfaced, historians gained insight into how the battalion maintained cohesion under prolonged stress. Rituals, shared routines, and informal leadership structures helped stabilize morale. Crew members developed unspoken communication, anticipating each other's actions during combat. These micro-level dynamics, shaped during World War II, explained how the unit remained functional despite exhaustion and loss. The impact of the 761st extended into cultural memory through memorials, documentaries, and scholarly works. Each retelling added context, situating their 183 days of combat within the broader operational demands faced by Third Army. Rather than isolating their service as exceptional, historians increasingly presented it as integral to sustaining momentum during critical phases of World War II. This evolving interpretation reframed Patton's reliance on the battalion. It was no longer seen as a gamble, but as a calculated decision informed by battlefield results. The repeated choice to keep the 761st engaged reflected confidence earned through performance. In this sense, their endurance became a strategic asset, enabling Third Army to absorb shocks and continue advancing when fatigue threatened to stall operations. The story of Black tankers fighting for 183 days straight thus remains open-ended. Each new analysis connects their experience to larger themes of military effectiveness, social change, and historical memory. Within the vast narrative of World War II, their sustained service continues to shape how endurance, trust, and opportunity are understood, not as abstract ideals, but as realities tested under the most demanding conditions of modern warfare.
As archival research expanded in the late 20th century and early 21st century, newly accessible unit logs and correspondence further illuminated how frequently the 761st Tank Battalion was assigned to missions considered high risk. These documents showed patterns of deployment that placed the battalion at points of friction along the front, where resistance was strongest or where breakthroughs had to be held at all costs. In World War II, such assignments reflected a commander's confidence that a unit could endure pressure without collapsing. Operational maps from 3rd Army headquarters revealed how the 761st often served as a stabilizing force during transitions between phases of advance. When infantry units, exhausted by combat, required armored support to regain momentum, the battalion was repeatedly brought forward. This role demanded flexibility as tank crews shifted from offensive thrusts to defensive holding actions with little notice. Their ability to adapt reinforced Patton's reliance on them during the fluid campaigns of World War II. The battalion's sustained presence also affected logistical planning. Supplying fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles to a unit that remained continuously engaged required careful coordination. Maintenance sections operated under constant strain, salvaging parts from disabled tanks and improvising repairs. These efforts, often invisible in traditional narratives of World War II, were essential to keeping the battalion operational and, by extension, supporting 3rd Army's tempo. From a human perspective, the accumulation of combat experience created a distinctive internal culture. Veterans described how the battalion developed its own standards of competence and accountability, shaped by months of shared danger. New arrivals were quickly evaluated and trained by experienced crews, accelerating their integration. This informal system of mentorship, forged in World War II, allowed the unit to maintain effectiveness despite turnover and losses. Medical records from the period also offer insight into the physical toll of continuous combat. Fatigue-related injuries, exposure to cold, and stress-related conditions appeared alongside combat wounds. Yet evacuation rates for non-battle injuries remained relatively low, reflecting both necessity and the reluctance of soldiers to leave their crews. In World War II, such endurance often came at long-term cost, a reality acknowledged only gradually in post-war studies. The 761st's operational history has increasingly been used to explore the relationship between morale and identity. Serving in a segregated unit intensified the desire to prove competence, not only to commanders, but to a nation that doubted them. This pressure, while unjust, contributed to a collective determination that sustained the battalion through extended hardship. In the context of World War II, such motivation intersected with professional pride to produce remarkable resilience. As public history initiatives expanded, the battalion's story became part of exhibitions examining the diversity of the American war effort. Curators emphasized how units like the 761st challenged simplified narratives of World War II by highlighting internal contradictions alongside external conflict. Their experience illustrated how democratic ideals were defended by soldiers denied full equality at home.
The integration of personal letters into historical analysis added another dimension. Correspondents sent home from the front often avoided explicit discussion of danger, yet hinted at exhaustion and uncertainty. Reading these letters alongside operational records reveals the dual reality of World War II, where strategic movements coexisted with private struggles that rarely entered official reports. The battalion's role in shaping post-war military thought continued as scholars examined how prolonged exposure to combat influenced leadership development. Officers who had served with or alongside the 761st carried these lessons into later assignments, informing training and command practices during the early Cold War. Their experience suggested that sustained operational stress could forge capable leaders when supported by cohesive units. In reassessing Patton's 3rd Army, historians increasingly view the 761st as an essential component rather than an auxiliary formation. Their endurance provided continuity during periods of rapid movement and intense resistance. This perspective reframes how World War II campaigns are understood, shifting attention from singular breakthroughs to the sustained effort required to maintain advance over time. The ongoing expansion of the battalion's narrative underscores how historical understanding remains dynamic. Each new source adds complexity, reinforcing the idea that World War II was shaped not only by decisive moments, but by the cumulative endurance of units that held the line day after day. The 761st Tank Battalion's 183 days of continuous combat remain a powerful lens through which to examine these broader themes, ensuring their experience continues to inform how the war is remembered and studied.